First, I'd like to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee's office and her staff for their invaluable assistance in making this briefing possible. Congresswoman Lee, who is probably the most productive member of the House, is a proud social worker and the chair of the Congressional Social Work Caucus. We at the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, or CRISP as we're known, are grateful to have this partnership with the McSilver Institute for Poverty Research and Policy. Besides being extraordinarily exceptional at research and policy, the people at McSilver are among the most likable people you'll ever meet. And I look forward to continued collaborations in the future. I have to give a special shout out to Dan Ferris because of the hard work he's done organizing this event. Let's give him a round of applause. While on the Hill, I worked with former Congressman Adolphus Towns to create the Congressional Social Work Caucus. How many of you know that we have a Social Work Caucus on the Hill? Okay, you should know, and hopefully more people will know as we move forward. So, and please mark your calendars for Tuesday and Wednesday, March 1st and 2nd, when we will host our second annual Social Work on the Hill Day. We believe social workers have much to contribute to policy and legislative deliberations in Congress and at all levels of government. And today's forum is an example of that. Getting juvenile justice policy right is crucial to our nation's future. Disrupting the cradle to prison pipeline should be at the foremost of our policy goals. I thank the panelists for participating. Thank you all for coming, and all of you who are watching this via live stream. Today's briefing is another demonstration of our commitment to unleash the power of social work on the Hill. And before I turn this over to Dr. McKay, I would like to invite Congressman Davis to say a few words for us today. Thank you. Congressman Danny Davis.
I grew up in an environment, and I had a teacher when I was in kindergarten. I went to a one-room school where Miss Beattie King taught 8 grades plus the little prim and the big prim by herself. And she used to tell us that a wise old owl sat on an oak. The more he heard, the less he spoke. And then she'd say the less he spoke, the more he heard. Now I want you boys to be like that wise old bird. I've learned one thing, and that is the more that I listen, the more potential I have to learn. But I want to commend all of you for being involved in this session, all of the panelists, because the issues you will be discussing are what I consider to be cutting-edge issues facing our society. We have a nation that have more people incarcerated than any other nation on the face of the earth, no matter how small it is or how large it is. And anything that we can do to interrupt those trends have to be good, wholesome, and helpful. So I thank you very much, and like Ms. Beattie said, I'm going to listen as long as I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words and for being here today. We so appreciate the support. And so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary McKay, and I have the real privilege of directing the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. And I am incredibly grateful that you have joined us in person in this room, and I'm looking right at that camera that you've joined us live from the web. So thank you so much for helping us to really spotlight a critical social justice issue that we hope that we can collectively address today and going forward. So Dr. Lewis, when you throw a party, people come. This is not the first time that we have had the real privilege of partnering with you and really trying to mobilize all of us to address social justice issues. I want to call your attention to the thing that all of us now are carrying around in our hand. If you go on the CRISP website, just yesterday, Dr. Lewis and colleagues issued a statement around race and public policy. So critically important that we read your words, Dr. Lewis, that we get involved with CRISP, we listen to the panelists, and we mobilize. We use the tools and the platforms that we have to make things right. And so I so thank you for being our partner and our good friend, and thank you for pulling us together. The title of today is not our original title. It's important, I'm an academic. I have to give credit where credit is due. In 2007, the Children's Defense Fund put out a critical report, America's Cradle to Prison Pipeline. And I and my colleagues reviewed that report, and I'd like to say that a report that came out in 2007 highlighted a set of issues that we had solved or were near to solving. And in fact, that's not the case at all. The poverty-impacted kids, kids of color, from almost the very beginning, have the possibility of entering a pipeline that winds them up in the justice system. And so if you haven't looked at that critical report from the Children's Defense Fund, easy to get online, also on the McSilver's website, please look at that, because it's a statement around how much work we still have to do. So the McSilver Institute is meant to be a very action-oriented academic institute, to create new knowledge, to address the root causes and consequences of poverty, and to help translate immediately actionable findings so that you all, from your various vantage points, can make a difference, the social change that we want to make. And the panelists really embody some of the best rapid translators of what we know in terms of what we do and how we do better. And so it's really my privilege to at least say their names and acknowledge their real participation. What is so important about the issues that we're going to talk about is there are a set of structural issues that can be changed that are pushing young people to very negative outcomes. 60% of kids in the justice system, their families are trying to live on less than $20,000 a year. If you just go up $10,000 more, 80% of kids in the juvenile justice system, their families are trying to make it on $30,000 a year. So I'm from New York City. Think you can do anything with that? Families are struggling, their children are struggling, and this is the moral hazard, this is the casualty, that kids are not having the opportunity to really live to their full potential. And so it is my privilege to shine a light on a number of really important issues. And so I'm just going to call your attention to a couple of things. You have in your hand, and those of you that are on the live stream, on the McSilver website, all these materials are posted. You have the biographies, the contact information for our speakers today. They are awesome. And they are powerful, powerful advocates that you can partner with and learn more about what they do. Those in the room, but also those that want to go to the McSilver website, know that we put out a 3-part series, Facts Matter, Black Lives Matter, the Trauma of Racism. In this public discourse around young people of color, we have called them bad kids, as opposed to bad structures, bad opportunities, blocked next steps for those young people. And so we're really trying to be very fact-based to counteract some of the discourse that I think is very, very negative for our young people and our families and our communities. So with that, I have to acknowledge just a couple of other people. Dan Ferris has already been acknowledged, done a fantastic job. In our audience, I hope on the live screen, but definitely in front of us today, are a set of volunteers, students, interns. They are our next generation for solving these critical issues. Particularly Felicia Mott, Carolyn Mulbauer, and John O'Neill helped put together a ton of the material that you're going to see today. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, read their biographies, go to their institution's website. They're really awesome, and so it's my privilege to at least say their names. With that, I'm honored to welcome today our esteemed speakers. Lisa Pilnik, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. She's going to lead off our panel. Next to her, Lisette Burton is going to speak, and she is the Director of the National Advocacy, Director for National Advocacy of Boys Town. After that, my colleague, Dr. Robert Hawkins from NYU, Silver School of Social Work, and the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. Dr. Hawkins will speak next. And then following that, Krista Larson, the Director for the Center on Youth Justice at the Vera Institute for Justice. I am so happy to sit down and learn from you. I'm going to ask you a few tough questions. But this audience is going to learn a lot from what you have to say, and I'm really looking forward to your remarks and the enriched discussion afterwards. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Everyone. So I'm Lisa Pilnik. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Sir? No? Okay. So I want to start out by thanking McSilver, Silver, Chris, NYU, all of the congressional staff, all of the people who are watching in the room and on the live stream. I just want to thank you, first of all, for having me here, but even more than that, for focusing your time and your attention on this issue, just because it is so important. And so we're always happy when people are looking at juvenile justice, because we're the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. But I think I want to tell you a little bit about CJJ just to start us off. Despite our title, I would actually say that a lot of CJJ's work is really focused on trying to keep youth out of the juvenile justice system whenever possible. And then when kids do have to be involved in the system, we really work to make sure that it's a system that upholds the highest standards of care, and making sure that kids, get the services they need to live healthy lives and to re-enter society and become sort of happy, productive adults. So CJJ is a membership and advocacy organization. Our members are governor-appointed state advisory groups on juvenile justice, as well as organizations and individuals who care about and work on these issues. I'm not going to go into my bio. I was told we should do our sort of self-bios. I think telling you about my organization is probably enough. The one maybe very relevant piece is that with CJJ, I was a lead author of the national standards for the care of youth charged with status offenses. So that's just an example of one of the things that I worked on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about status offenses. So I was asked to talk about the federal law and the federal sort of outlook on juvenile justice. And I was only given 10 minutes to do that, including my bio and all of that other stuff. So I'm mostly going to focus on the one major law. But I will just sort of say as background that what happens to kids in the juvenile justice system is very, very different from state to state and even from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So we are seeing states and localities doing better and frankly, in some cases, doing worse on lots of different issues, including the age or just the manner in which kids are sent to the adult system, whether or not kids can be locked up for things like skipping school or running away from home, whether or not kids are in solitary confinement, whether or not kids are shackled in court, what kind of defense they get in terms of a legal defender, especially if they can't afford one. And so there's a huge range of variations. It's something that our executive director likes to talk about as justice by geography, and that's something that we don't think should exist. So luckily there is a great piece of federal legislation, a federal law that does set some very baseline protections so that even though, the situation of kids in one state and another are not always the same, we do have some core protections for kids. So that law is called the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, and it is a federal law that was passed 40 years ago with strong bipartisan support. It was last reauthorized in 2002. However, we are seeing some good movement on reauthorization, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the main thing about this law is that it's a funding mechanism. States can get funding, and they can use that funding to help kids stay out of the system or make sure that when kids are in the system, they are getting the protections that they need. And in order to get the monies available under the JJDPA, states have to comply with 4 core protections. So I'm going to just outline those for you really quickly. So the first and probably most relevant to this discussion is around disproportionate minority contact with the system, otherwise known as racial and ethnic disparities. And there's some differences, but that's just another phrase that you'll hear sort of used in the field. So the DMC requirement, which started out actually as a requirement around disproportionate minority confinement, and it was broadened to be contact to recognize the fact that we are seeing kids of color overrepresented at every point along the way. And we taught that decision points, so at arrest, at charging, and what kind of placement they get, things like that. So states have to assess and address disproportionate minority contact within the system. I could give you a lot of statistics about how bad the overrepresentation is, but I only have 10 minutes, and I also think most people kind of understand that that's the case, so I'm just going to share one quick set of numbers for you. In 2010, African American youth made up 17% of all children between the ages of 10 and 17, but they were 31% of juvenile arrests, 40% of detentions, 34% of adjudications, and 45% of transfers to the adult court. So there's a lot of different numbers out there. Some will say, youth of color are 4 times more likely to be locked up and so on. But any set of statistics you look at will say that it's a very disproportionate treatment of kids. And so when we talk about these issues, we kind of look at it in 3 ways. So there's just a numbers issue that kids are overrepresented. If you look at the number of kids in the community who are kids of color versus the number who are arrested and incarcerated and so on. But then we also look at disparate treatment. So, how and why are these kids having these different outcomes? And then there's also a focus on kids of color being unnecessarily staying in the system and moving deeper into the system. So at the deeper end of system involvement, you see that even more. So another thing I want to point out quickly is just that as a country, we've actually been doing a lot better about locking up fewer juveniles. However, you would think that would mean we were doing better, at least staying the same on the disparities issue, and unfortunately we're not. We're seeing more kids of color proportionally locked up, even though we're locking up fewer kids. And so there's some different theories on that, but I think as a field we're realizing it's not enough to just put a diversion program into place, but we really need to look at who the diversion program is serving. Is it for, whatever reasons, reaching white kids more than kids of color, and then how do we fix that? And how do we design different policies and practices to keep kids out that are actually going to help keep kids of color out of the system? So I think I'm not going to get into too much more detail because I know Dr. Hawkins is going to talk later about how poverty and race and trauma all kind of coexist and lead to some of these things, and I do have several other parts of the law to get to. So that's all I'm going to say for right now on the disproportionate minority contact requirement, but as I said, that's one of the 4 sort of key things in the Federal Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. So another major part of it, another protection for kids, deals with what are called status offenses. So legally, status offenses are acts or behaviors that are only illegal because of the person's age. So if you were an adult, you couldn't get charged with truancy for not going to school, with running away from home, curfew violations, something that's called ungovernability or unruliness. I'm just going to sort of take a moment to talk about terminology just for a second. I'm going to talk about status offenses throughout this presentation because that's the legal term. But I will just note that I and CJJ, and I think the field generally, doesn't love using that term because it doesn't really capture the fact that these are kids who have unmet needs. These are kids who are not a public safety risk at all. They're doing things that are, in some cases, there's sort of normal teenage behaviors, like maybe not going to school. But when you have the kids who are doing those things really chronically, it is because of something that is going on in their home or in their school. And so, you know, a young person who is running away from an abusive home is not an offender. They are actually surviving. They're exhibiting a survival skill. Similarly, a child who's not going to school, they may be doing that because of, you know, for self-defense if they're being bullied at school. They may be doing it because they have special education needs that are not being met. They may be doing it, going back to the poverty lens, because they need to take care of younger siblings so their parents can work, or reasons like that. And so we try not to use the word offenders, although sometimes it is necessary and it is in the law, so I'm gonna use that term just for now. So when the law was passed 40 years ago, you know, a driving force was to recognize that kids are different and to protect children. And so at that time, kids who did these acts like not going to school or not listening to their parents could be locked up indefinitely and also with adults. And so the law currently has something called the deinstitutionalization of status offenders requirement, which basically just means you can't securely confine or detain kids for committing these acts, which are truancy and curfew violations and so on. There are exceptions in that law, and unfortunately some of them have been used pretty widely and pretty broadly. The biggest exception that is a focus right now, and I'll talk about how it might change as the law changes, is something called the valid court order exception, which basically means if you skip school and then you go to court and a judge tells you, don't skip school again, and then you skip school again, the judge can then lock you up because he or she isn't locking you up for that status offense of skipping school, he or she is locking you up now for violating a court order. And that exception has been called by scholars the exception that swallowed the rule. It used to be really, really overused. We actually are seeing some good trends in terms of it being used a lot less. About half the states no longer use it. We at CJJ, the Vera Institute, and many others have been working on this issue of status offenses for a long time and trying to make sure that kids, you know, are kept out of the system whenever possible and certainly not locked up. And we've definitely seen some forward movement on this, although I will say, getting back to race issues, you do see disparities, racial disparities in status offenses, just like every other offense. Curfews, which are a status offense, you know, are disproportionately in cities, in urban areas, and so that also, you know, ties into poverty and race, but I'm getting a 2-minute sign, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail on that. So the other core protections are jail removal and sight and sound separation, and basically what those say is that kids who are charged as delinquent rather than charged as adults can't be housed in adult jails except under extremely limited circumstances, and if they are housed in adult jails for those limited circumstances, they have to be separated by sight and sound. So this is a good law. It's made things much better for kids in this country. Before, when kids were routinely kept in adult settings, it was just terrible for kids. I mean, kids who are in adult jails are at higher risk for suicide, for sexual and physical abuse, or a whole host of poor outcomes. And so the law has made things much better. However, as I said, it was last reauthorized in 2002. So there's a lot that we've learned since then that really just isn't reflected in the law. There's a lot we've learned about adolescent brain development. There's a lot we've learned about trauma and the impacts of trauma, about gender differences, about the costs and the effects of incarcerating children. So there's a Senate Bill 1169 that's been passed out of the Judiciary Committee that would update and revise the JJDPA, and there's a House bill that has some of the language already, and I believe there's going to be a House bill that's actually closer to the Senate bill, just because when the House and Senate versions are closer, it's easier to go ahead and pass them and then go to conference with them. So just quickly, the highlights of that is it would eliminate the valid court order exception, which I talked about before. It would give better direction to the states around the disproportionate minority contact requirements. and it would allow, it would extend these protections about keeping kids out of adult jails to some youth who are charged as adults if they're under 18 and depending on the circumstances of their case. There's a bunch of other great stuff in the bill. I'm not going to talk about it too much now because we are low on time, but one of the handouts that is outside and is on the web for those of you watching the live cast talks about sort of a step-by-step look at what's in the bill that's different. The one thing I'll just say is that another sort of term that we use a lot at CJJ is underserved youth. So those are the kids who the juvenile justice system either wasn't built for, or the justice system just doesn't often see as being there even when they are. A lot of those kids, I think, actually are going to be helped by a lot of the things in this bill. So it talks a lot more about trauma. It talks more about evidence-based practices. It gives more direction on defenders for juveniles and things like that. And so when you talk about, for example, kids who are entering the system from homelessness or exiting the system to homelessness, those are kids who are going to benefit from some of these provisions, especially around the status offenses. When you look at kids of color, I think that even though people realize that there's a disproportionality, until they look at the data, they don't realize how extreme it is. There's kids, for example, children who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Some of the research that's been done on that is that there's a high percentage, about 20% in juvenile detention facilities, but the facilities don't realize that. And so you'll talk to people who are directing these juvenile detention facilities and they'll say, oh yeah, we had one kid, which is just clearly not the case numerically. So there's a lot of great stuff in that bill. I'm gonna pass it over to Lisette in just under a minute to talk about what it is that states do with the money that they receive under JJDPA and to talk about some more of the details of how this plays out in communities. The one thing I'll just ask you to keep in mind as you listen to Lisette talking about all these important things is that since 2002, which was the last reauthorization, the funding for juvenile justice has dropped by 54%. So we need this law, we need it updated, and we need it funded. And so those are kind of the main things that at the federal legislative level are happening right now. Thanks everyone for your time.
Hi, good afternoon. Oh, is that better? All right. Good afternoon again, everyone. My name again is Lisette Burton. I just want to echo the thanks to the McSilver Institute, to the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, to the Congressional Social Work Caucus for hosting this timely and really important briefing. So I currently am the Director of National Advocacy for Boys Town, and I was previously appointed to the State Advisory Group for DC. We call it the Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. It has a different name in every state, but that's the group that Lisa referenced, and those groups are responsible really for helping to take these federal mandates through JJDPA and incorporate those locally. So instead of it just being the federal government telling states and localities what to do and how to do it, these state advisory groups really can take charge and take control of determining what are their local needs and how can we best address those. So I'm based here in DC, although Boys Town has locations across the country, and we were founded almost 100 years ago in 1917 in Omaha, Nebraska, by a man named Father Edward Flanagan, who was a Catholic priest. We're not a Catholic organization. And although our name is Boys Town, we do serve both boys and girls across the country through a variety of child welfare and juvenile justice programs. So today, I'm privileged to participate in these kinds of policy discussions that are very important. But prior to that, I worked for over a decade directly with children and youth and families directly in their communities. And that experience certainly has informed my understanding about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to juvenile justice, and about who should be at the table when we have these really crucial and important conversations. It's also cemented my understanding that the most important thing that we can do for delinquent youth are the same things that we typically talk about when we're talking about child welfare. And that includes providing normalcy, building skills, and partnering with families every step of the way. Too often we talk about what a youth did and how we can help that youth do better, and not enough about the family and community and social dynamics that have led that young person to be where they are at that particular point in time. So I hope to share with you through my brief comments, and I'll keep an eye out for the time card to keep me on track, about the practical implications of the JJDPA. What does it fund? What does it do? And the research experts on either side of me, have already detailed some of that and will detail more. But I also hope to, whether you're a social worker or aspiring to be a social worker or a congressional staffer, or already doing good work on the ground in your own communities, to give a few tips that might be helpful to you at the end of this panel when it's all said and done. I also hope to infuse the voice of young people and their families that I've worked with over the years. I think that's crucial. They are dealing with these systems in their day-to-day lives right now as we speak and as we have these conversations. So I was a family teacher at Boys Town. As a family teacher, we lived where we worked. We had first a home of girls in the child welfare system, up to 6 girls, and then we had a home with boys in the juvenile justice system. One of the reasons I was first drawn to Boys Town was the history. So the founder, Father Flanagan, really based Boys Town in a philosophy of innovation, of healing, of inclusiveness, and of hope. And those philosophies have continued to guide the organization today. Father Flanagan had a saying, there is no such thing as a bad boy or girl. There is only bad environment, bad training, bad example, and bad thinking. Now, I know when I say that, some people might think that that's naive, and it echoes the remarks made at the opening of this conversation. But I think the acknowledgement of bad behavior is a crucial distinction from writing off a young person as a bad human being. We do that too often now. We're throwing away our young people and all the potential that comes with each and every one of them. And so nationally, when we look at our nation's juvenile justice reform over the years, we have moved from a system of punishment to a system where we at least discuss and prioritize how we provide rehabilitation. That is the goal, that's what we're doing. And Congressman Davis addressed in the beginning the need to disrupt the current trends around the crisis that we're currently having, the mass incarceration crisis, and the need to reform broadly the criminal justice system. But one of the most important things we can do to reduce the adult prison population and the associated economical and societal costs of that is to provide effective prevention and intervention strategies for kids. In addition to the court protections provided by the Act, I would like to bring your attention to 3 key aspects of the JJDPA, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, and what it does to improve outcomes for kids and families. The first is alternatives to incarceration, what we can do to effectively help children besides locking them away. The second is to support and fund effective local programs, which is what the JJDPA does. And the third is that the law really does help bring focused attention on our most vulnerable youth. So starting with community-based services and other alternatives to incarceration, I do want to echo that between 1997 and 2011, the rates of confinement and arrest for violent offenses dropped by 50%, which is great news. I mean, that's the result of our collective work as a nation to improve how we practice, and those are the lowest rates in 30 years. That's in part due to the JJDPA and having a federal mandate for what we can do better. Community-based and family-centered treatment for youth has been shown to be far more effective and cost-efficient than incarceration, and research has shown us what methods and techniques work with at-risk youth. So we know what to do. It's just a matter of prioritizing and finding the will to do it and make it work in our various communities. We know that even short stays in detention can have a really negative impact on young people. So some communities have already implemented several of these new practices with good results, and for every dollar invested in community-based youth development and prevention efforts, we dramatically reduce delinquency and save taxpayer dollars. And I know that that's an important factor. We're here at a congressional briefing. We want to be good stewards of our public money, right? That's important. But we know the approaches that can best bring about the outcomes that we are looking for. And so the Council for State Governments has identified 4 core principles to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for youth. And the first is utilizing validated risk assessments, right? When we're being really intentional about what are the difficulties that a young person is having, how does that fit into the context of a family, we can better intervene and help that young person and their family. We don't have to guess. We can be very intentional about figuring out what's going on and how we can help. The second is identifying programs that work. Notice I said programs that work, not necessarily evidence-based programs. That's a hot button. I think we have some social workers in the room, and I know some folks out there who have feelings about that. In my opinion, this is me talking. The 2 terms have become interchangeable when they aren't necessarily. Evidence-based programs require clinical trials and all these things. But the bottom line is we need to identify programs that work. And what might work here in a community in DC might not work for a community in Oklahoma. And we need to, thank you, I appreciate that. But we need to identify programs that work in the communities where they are. The third core principle is a coordinated approach across systems. I mentioned earlier that the young people in the child welfare system and young people in the juvenile justice system, often they're the same kids. And we really need to look at how do we help our systems communicate with each other effectively, even into the schools and through the court system, so that we are providing worthwhile and effective interventions for kids. And the fourth is developmentally appropriate, and I'll add trauma-informed services. And those things are key in terms of kind of the four core principles that we need to look at when states and localities are looking to implement programs. So the efficacy of our model, the Boys Town model, has been established. We're fortunate enough to have the resources to have a National Research Institute to document what we've been able to do over the long term. But of course, not all programs need to use our model to be successful. There are many models out there that work well for young people. But there are certain features that all out-of-home placements really should have if they're going to provide quality, life-changing care to young people. First, they have to be safe, right? One of the reasons youth advocates are opposed to secure detention facilities is due to the level of violence that young people experience while in such settings. Second, those programs have to have qualified and well-trained staff, preferably with regular accreditation or certification process, which I know is expensive, but it's really helpful. Ideally, this includes an extensive pre-service training. So I've worked for a couple different organizations. The hallmarks of both were that I spent 3 to 4 weeks on the front end getting trained before I even interacted with a young person. And I feel like that set my foundation and allowed me to be more effective as I worked directly with kids and their families. Third, programs should be skill-based so that youth are getting concrete outcomes that can be practically applied when they get home. That's key. And finally, programs must have a structured model of care. Too often, programs teach staff members various theories, but don't necessarily provide a structured framework to modify youth behavior, which is what we're trying to do. And that can lead to inconsistent outcomes based largely on the natural ability or charisma of different staff members, as opposed to the program model or manual that might actually be very effective if implemented correctly. So even when these programs exist in a community, even when they're working, too few states are actually tracking recidivism. I was disturbed to find out that 20% of jurisdictions don't track recidivism of their young people. And those that do, unfortunately, are often missing crucial pieces of information. Not just was this young person rearrested, but other youth outcomes that are crucial, such as educational attainment, skill development, behavioral health, and family functioning. All of those are important parts of a young person, again, returning to their community successfully and for the long term. Referencing those points again, research suggests that connecting with youth in a family-oriented manner and placing an emphasis on substance abuse education and intervention when it's applicable may really serve as protective factors against recidivism. 2 minutes, I'm gonna hurry up. And then lastly, I wanna touch on aftercare, which is so important. So we touch a young person, but it's really important that particularly for youth who have a high risk of reoffending, that we follow up with that young person with crucial ongoing aftercare. So the second point I mentioned about the law is support for effective local programs. I'm not going to go state by state. That would take another 30 minutes, and I have about 1.5 minutes. But the key thing is if you go to the CJJ website, you can look up in your individual state, wherever you might be, and see what your state advisory group is doing. And find out what are the programs that are being implemented. Sometimes there are people who are getting funding and don't even realize that it's connected to those federal dollars. So I'd encourage you to look that up in your state. One quick example here from DC. DC, our local SAG, again, we call it the JJAG, all these acronyms, focused on truancy, because we recognized we had a major truancy problem in DC, and one of the ways we could touch families early, as an early intervention model, was to identify children who had missed school, make a referral for those families to receive in-home family services, and then touch that family, including all the siblings and the parents and everyone in that home, to hopefully prevent future involvement in the juvenile justice system. So programs like that are innovative, that can deal with prevention and early intervention as opposed to just a reactive intervention after the fact. Another program I'd like to bring your attention to is in Connecticut. Their state advisory group partnered with the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance to facilitate dialogues, and they call this the Color of Justice Initiative. I thought it was really innovative. I'd encourage people to look this up. It addresses specifically disproportionate minority contact, which unfortunately the JJDPA has not moved the needle on that as much as we all would like over the years. But again, these are facilitated dialogues. They've had over 2,000 people participate in these dialogues, and it's giving folks concrete strategies and insights to take back to their workplaces and to their communities. And then the last point I mentioned I was going to touch on of why the JJDPA is important is it focuses our attention on our most vulnerable youth. I know folks after me are going to talk about race and poverty, so I'm going to skip that. But quickly, I just want to point out that up to 2/3 of all youth in the juvenile justice system have had contact with the child welfare system. We have to acknowledge that. We have to focus on cross-systems communication so we can effectively help those young people. There's an increased proportion of girls entering the system. The new law helps to address that and has a specific pot of money and interventions to focus on girls and how do we address their specific gender needs. And then there's also a disproportionate of kids with special needs. I'm out of time. I real quick wanted to tell you a story of a young person, Dan, that's not his real name, but who embodies a vulnerable youth. He came to us in our home with, his family had been chronically homeless. His mother was drug addicted, but she loved him and wanted the best for him. He had severe special needs. He was developmentally delayed, and he was a big kid. He was about 6'3", and that's a big target. He found himself in the juvenile justice system and eventually made his way to our home. He had been incarcerated. He had had horrible experiences along the way. But when he was in a family-style environment with lots of supports, we worked with his mom to help build her skills, and we worked with him. And on paper, most people probably would have been afraid of Dan, but you get him in a house, and some of my most vivid memories of him are doing family things at Easter, an egg toss, right, with egg all over him. Something like that probably would have set him off at one point, but we had worked with him on building his skills for anger management and how to deal with things, and he became a young person who was a kid again, and who could go to school again. We worked with his school to not call the police when he would have outbursts, and it takes those kinds of partnerships and interventions to let kids be kids, and help move them away from a path of the adult system and prison and back towards a path of being a productive member of society, which they all have the potential to be. So as this panel wraps up, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, I got this from the Connecticut model. Their model focuses on watch, learn, talk, and act. So as this panel ends and at the end as we listen to the rest of our speakers and ask questions at the end, certainly you're watching, hopefully folks are learning something. I would encourage you to then talk to one another, take this information back to your workplaces and your communities, and then act, whether that's joining your state advisory group or at least looking into what they're doing and giving some information about that. Contact your congressman and encourage your senators to support S 1169, the JJDPA reauthorization, and encourage the folks in the House to go ahead and pass a companion bill and get that done. We're over a decade overdue. And I would encourage you all to take the knowledge that you have, particularly those working directly with kids and families, and advocate. I know that we're busy doing the good work every day, but your voices are crucial and important, and they matter, and you should share them. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Lisette, you said a lot of great things that I want to comment on, I want to follow up on, but we'll see what I get to. My name is Robert Hawkins. I'm an associate professor, the McSilver Associate Professor in Poverty Studies at New York University. And my focus today is going to be on three things, and I am going to try to do it in 10 minutes. Poverty, race, and trauma. And I want to alert your attention to the booklet outside, if you didn't pick it up, from McSilver called Poverty as Trauma, Racism as Trauma. It is a good read. I'm going to touch on some of the points, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper than that paper. I want to talk about poverty first, because we've been talking about poverty, whether we know it or not. And I'm going to start out, I'm going to tell a story, too, from a true story from when I was a kid. And I'm going to give this person the name William Jones. And so I remember William from when maybe second or third grade. And William was the classic bully. And he was a big kid. And we were all about 7, I think he was 11, and we were in the second and third grade. And, you know, he was always getting into trouble. He was always acting out. We moved on to middle school. William was still there, and really engaging in some of the same behavior, except he was much bigger now. He was, you know, he stood, it felt like 2 feet above the rest of us. And again, he followed the same pattern. Until one day, William just wasn't there anymore. And I always wondered what happened to him. And I learned a few years later in high school that he had been incarcerated. And at what point, I don't know. I didn't get enough detail. But what I know now that I didn't know then was that William was dealing with a few different things. He lived in poverty. We all did. This was rural North Carolina. If you were a black person, you probably lived in poverty. And so I'm going to get to that. But I saw William as someone who could not, 20 years later, I saw him as someone who could not regulate his emotions. So he was dealing with severe emotional dysregulation. And so so I had a question about that. William was fairly intolerant. He was not very patient. He had anger management issues. And it made me start to think, well, what happens to those kids who can't regulate their emotions, who have anger issues, who are kids of color, who grew up poor? What is going on there? What happened? And the juvenile justice system gave me my answer, because that's where many of them end up. And one of the things about poverty is we think about poverty, and Dr. McKay gave a great example of how many kids in the juvenile justice system come from poor backgrounds. But we think about poverty as money, as either having enough money or not having enough money. If you don't have enough money, a certain marker, then you're poor. The way I think about poverty and the way many researchers are starting to really think about poverty, it's more as a lack of access to resources, education, opportunities that live in neighborhoods, in schools, in families, and in the bodies and mind. And this is where regulation comes in. This is where a lot of the stress factors come in. We have drawn, over the years, a very strong association between growing up in poverty and negative health outcomes, growing up in poverty and negative mental health outcomes. So as we think about that child who grows up in poverty and who's struggling with dysregulation, who's struggling with anger management, who might be too dark or too tall or too big, and their encounter, they come from this traumatized development, they start to act out. They have impaired capacity. So that means they have low self-esteem, and then they are dealing with a current stressor. The stressor might be in the family, it might be in the schools, it might be in their environment, or it might be an initial or even ongoing contact with police. That's when we start to see the extreme coping behaviors that puts them in the juvenile justice system. That's where we start to see it. In addition, of course, there are all of these structural factors that are going on. We can't ignore the poverty, of course. We can't ignore the structural racism. All of that's happening as well. And since I mentioned race, I want to talk about race as a factor here, race as a stressor. So dating back to about 1991, and maybe even a little bit further, we've drawn a few correlations, and some of those correlations have been around poverty and stress, but also race and stress. We talked about it for a long time, but it took us a while to really study it as a major stressor. And finally, the National Institutes of Health, the American Psychological Association, have finally started to pinpoint that connection between racial social identity, especially among African Americans and Asian Americans, as major stressors. So what that means is that as your identity develops, you become a stronger, more self-aware person of color, African American, for example, and then you realize, wait, there's something going on. Something's not treating me right. There's a system here that has marginalized me, that causes stress, and that stress stays in the body as well. So you have this combination for a lot of these kids of having grown up in poverty, which creates chronic stress, having experienced perceived real discrimination, which also causes stress. You start to have from that, you can have from that a traumatized reaction, which leads you to sometimes what we may consider extreme coping strategies. So what do we do with that? What happens when all that sort of falls into place? It turns out we are not exactly treating what could be, not always, but could be a mental health issue, an issue of lack of resources, an issue of chronic stress, an issue of coping. We're treating that with what the textbooks calls secure placement, or incarceration, as I call it. And so as we're thinking about this, and we're thinking about moving the measures, moving the conversation forward, and creating policies, we need to think about policies that get at some of the structural issues. In the United States, in my opinion, we have no anti-poverty policies. I'm going to say this in Congress. We have no anti-poverty policies. We think we have one. We think it's the Earned Income Tax Credit, but it's not. The Earned Income Tax Credit is an income enhancement program for poor people. That's very different than getting at barriers to resources, education, opportunities. That's a very, very different thing. We have no trauma reduction policies to address juvenile youth in the juvenile justice system. And I'm talking policies. I'm not talking about individual programs that might use that approach, but I'm talking about larger policies. So instead of, we do have some alternatives to incarceration, but if we are reducing funding, funding says a lot. You all know that. But we have no policies that really support a trauma framework for addressing youth in the system. And finally, we actually have no anti-racism policies. And what I mean by anti-racism policies that pay attention to the historical relevance of racism and the contemporary impact. That's missing. That's missing from the conversation, missing from the dialogue about this. And in looking at what I know, or what I think I know, when I look at the data tells me poverty plays a huge role in what we see in the juvenile justice system. It tells me that race and racism plays a role as well, and we need more than really a conversation about it. We need policies around it. And until we understand what we see as a combination of poverty and racism that produces trauma, we're going to keep running in place. And I don't know how else to put it, so I thought I'd take the opportunity here to say that. So I'm looking forward to having a dialogue about this. I think it's something that I am very, very proud to be a part of the McSilver Institute, because we have these conversations. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Krista now. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a blessing and a sort of dubious honor to go last. On the one hand, a lot of my panelists have done some of the heavy lifting for me on some of the things that are important to inject into this conversation. On the other hand, I'm standing between you and this important dialogue we're going to have when I finish talking. So I will also try to keep it brief. So my name is Krista Larson. I'm the director of the Center on Youth Justice at the Vera Institute of Justice. And Vera is a national nonprofit. We have offices in New York, New Orleans, Los Angeles, and here in DC. And for over 50 years, we've been dedicated to the notion that the systems that people rely on can be fair and just, they can respect dignity, and they can achieve positive outcomes both for the public and for the individuals that encounter these systems. And Vera was funded over 50 years ago by two guys who met at a dinner party that decided that with some good ideas, a little bit of cash, which should never be underestimated, and some well-meaning staff, that they could make a difference. And one of them named it after their mom. That's why it's Vera. It's actually not an acronym, despite our block letters there. You've learned one thing here, if nothing else, about Vera. And together they set about trying to tackle some of the most intractable problems, first in New York City and then across the nation. And the way they began to do this was to really critically assess how systems were working, think about some positive solutions, try some of them out, and then test what we learned from that. And one of the quotes that's on our conference room wall is, a wonderful way to learn something is to do something. A wonderful way to learn is to do something. And I share that history because to this day, every day, we're trying to repeat it at Vera. And I also think history is important, as Robert just shared, as we're talking about juvenile justice, because I think one of the criticisms and one of the discussions that's happening now in the field in what feels like a new way is that the reason why we haven't been able to move the dial on some of the racial and ethnic disparities or disproportionate minority contact or confinement is that we've tried to approach it with an ahistorical lens. We wanted to implement programs that would benefit everyone, and surely that will do it. We don't need to talk about things that are difficult from our past. We can just improve things for everyone. But as Lisa shared, what we've seen is that sometimes certain groups of kids have benefited more from our advances, and so there is much more work to do. And a lot of the conversation in the field now is that we have to be able to talk about the history, that our juvenile justice system has some of its roots in child-saving movements that removed young people of color from their families because their families were not trusted to take good care of them. And that's important for us to hold in the room. Now, Vera always approaches things from a data perspective whenever we can, and that includes lots of different sources of data, system practitioner knowledge, academic research type knowledge, administrative data with numbers. I have people that do that for me and help me with that. And increasingly, the lived experiences of young people and people directly affected by systems, family members, grown folks who have been incarcerated as well. And so we're trying very hard these days to hold those 3 points of that triangle as important pieces and sources of information that inform our work on a daily basis. And my esteemed panelists have done a lot of the work in talking about some of the research that's out there now that is driving some of the reforms in the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system. And I won't repeat some of that. One of the pieces that I'd like to just touch on is this notion of light touch, where one of the things that we've learned again and again is when we over-respond to small infractions, we get terrible outcomes. In a lot of instances with young people, whether they're charged with status offenses, as Lisa was talking about, or minor delinquent offenses, we can usually only make things worse by getting involved. Now, sometimes people will say we should take a no wrong door approach, that this young person has come to the attention of the system and we should attach services, we should do something. And I think that that can be the right answer. What we have to be careful about is when we compel those services using the force of the justice system. We should be able to move them into the systems that are designed to help them, or should be designed or redesigned to help them, so that they can get health care, child welfare, mental health care. If there are services that they need, they should get them. They should not get them under the penalty of incarceration, because I do think that language is important and we should be using that word. We use the word placement a lot in delinquency, and we use the word delinquency. But we use the word placement a lot, and what we mean, and this is increasingly showing up in the field in the reform movements, is that what we're talking about is youth prisons. It's not all we're talking about. We have other ways of removing young people from their homes and communities, but a lot of times what we are talking about is youth prisons, and we should say that if that's what we mean. And as social workers on the services, because I am too a proud social worker, I think it's really important for us and those of us who are educating social workers and those of us who are social workers, we have to understand the criminal justice system and its reach. That we are failing that when we take services, we implement them under penalty of incarceration. When we give clients very little say in where they get services, we have an obligation to create quality services that work, not necessarily evidence-based. I'll say that one more time, that those two don't have to be the same thing. But we have an obligation to create services that work for the communities that we're serving, because if we're going to insist that people participate without being able to vote with their feet, the way my mom might have if she had taken me to a counselor and didn't like what was happening, we would have left. That's not always available for young people, and so it's exceedingly important that we as service providers and as policymakers can create spaces for clients to have that self-determination. And I think one of the main things, and we've touched on this, but I think it's a good note to sort of wrap up on, is this radical notion that kids are different from adults. And this brain research that has sort of occupied the discussion over the last several years, that has shown up in Supreme Court decisions, that has shown up again and again in policy decisions, it really just attaches PET scans and names for brain structures that maybe we learned about in middle school or 10th grade, to a phenomenon that most of us understand. These are not adults. And anyone who's been a parent of an adolescent, or really anyone who has been an adolescent, knows that they can take the same set of facts as an adult might get, and reach, which is sometimes an unfathomable conclusion. And this is a phenomenon which is exacerbated seemingly exponentially when they are near their peers. And this research has been critical in moving this policy discussion about kids in the justice system. As I said, it's shown up in Supreme Court decisions, it's shown up again and again in our state legislatures talking about this, as our courts and our legislatures are being asked to wrestle with science as well as parents, saying that kids don't forfeit their status as a child simply because of an illegal act, even an egregious one, even a serious one. And across the country, as we see changes in the adult time for adult crime policies that characterize the late 20th century, states are acknowledging that handling kids as adults generally leads to worse outcomes, whether we're talking about egregious harms that happen when we incarcerate young people as adults, as Lisa touched on, Or even, and this is important in this discussion, even when they just are processed as adults. We don't have to put them in prison to get terrible outcomes for young people. We're not only talking about incarceration. Handling young people as adults leads to bad outcomes. And we see this wrestling with how states are handling young people under 18, like in my home state of New York, where, as Dr. McKay said, we try every young person over 16 as an adult. Or the debate is actually shifting. Just within the last month, we've seen Governor Malloy in Connecticut start a conversation about how they want to be handling young adults and considering raising the age of jurisdiction above 18 to possibly 21. And as an aside, and I did see my 2-minute warning, Governor Malloy was one of a delegation that joined some of my colleagues from the Vera Institute of Justice on a trip to Germany earlier this year, where they saw facilities that are based in a constitution that is grounded in human dignity, where the training that their officers receive is not weeks but years, and those are coveted positions that people really want to have to work in those facilities because it's been prioritized as a vulnerable population that needs the country's help and support. And our delegation was fascinated by that, shocked by it. We had to explain to our German hosts that, first of all, we incarcerate children because they don't do that there. Their age of jurisdiction is 23. And all of this is very important because policy is about drawing lines. And we can draw lines, we can make choices about where we draw lines. And in the 90s, we decided we were going to draw lines earlier and earlier and push more and more young people into the adult system. And now the conversation is pushing a little bit. We shouldn't rest on our laurels. We should remain vigilant about this conversation because we need to keep it active, which is why I appreciate this forum here and this conversation. And we're constantly faced with this idea of drawing lines. Who is a child? Who is an adult? Who's guilty? Who's innocent? People are either charged with experiencing harm or causing it, and those two are not always mutually exclusive. They're either worthy of our protection or the full force of our retribution. So I think as we think about this, we have a tremendous amount of power and potential in this conversation to help our society draw the right lines. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you. So, panel, can I just say wow? And have this audience and those of you at home just give a round of applause for an outstanding set of panelists. So as the moderator, I have this kind of burden about how do I say thank you and convey kind of my respect for the comments that you made for us. And so I thought I would give you a letter grade, like the ones that maybe you got in school. And I'm going to give you a letter grade for disruptive behavior. You get an A. Because that's what I heard you really challenge us today, is to be disruptive. Each of you in your own ways. You said that we can be disruptive by passing new laws, by finding it just ridiculous that we have something that can be helpful that we've let be out of date, unfunded, and that we can be disruptive by passing the laws that you identified. We can be disruptive by funding and expanding programs that work, that we know a lot about how to help kids and their families, and that's a real disruption from the status quo that we have now. Dr. Hawkins really charged us with being disruptive by saying words together that matter, poverty and race and trauma, and to speak the truth about the situation and the historical drivers that get us here and that keep the status quo in place. And then our last speaker said that in order to be truly disruptive, we have to draw new lines. We have to think about the policies that we are not creating as really being unjust. And so I so appreciate this panel. I hope you will agree that on their report card they should get an A for disruption. So I'm going to start us off with a first question, but I hope that as they answer, you are formulating yours so that we can have a discussion. And Dr. Lewis is appropriately pointing to, if you could start to line up here for at the microphone, we will take your questions in addition to some of the panelists can also ask questions as well. So I'm going to start with a question, and it's actually a quote first. Frederick Douglass said, "It's easier to build strong children than it is to fix broken adults." He actually said broken men, but the statistic that one of you said about girls, the number of girls in juvenile justice has gone up 200%, so I just switched it to adults. It's easier to build strong children than to fix broken adults. As specifically as you can, what should we do to really not even be talking about kids in the justice system? If you could give us some very specific ideas, and then we'll have the audience ask you some questions as well.
Okay, so first of all, I'm kind of glad now that I started by telling you that my organization works really hard to keep kids out of the system, because I feel like that gives me a little bit more of a leg to stand on in answering this question. But I do think, I spent maybe 3 of my 10 minutes talking about status offenses, but I actually think that, tying it back to that quote, how do we keep kids out of the system in the first place, that's such a low-hanging fruit, that's such an easy thing to do, is to say, if a kid isn't going to school, why would we call the police? Why would we send them to court? Like, why would that ever be the right answer? If a kid isn't going to school, why don't we find out why they aren't going to school, and then, depending on what the underlying reasons are, address that through services, if it's tied to poverty, mental health, all of the different things that kids need. And similarly with running away and all of the other status offenses, I think if we can all sort of come to a place where that is not considered to be an offense, it's not something that can get you charged and involved with the courts, that to me is a good first step. So I would say that that's something that, in terms of how you do that, I mean, part of that is advocating for local reform. So there are states that have laws on this, but also, there are cities where the police work with the schools. Philadelphia is a good example. The police have worked really closely with the schools so that now, and it's not just for status offenses, but all school-based offenses, if a kid is acting out in school, instead of just calling the police and charging them, they have an array of diversion options, and they're working closely with other partners in the community. So that's just one idea, and I want to give time for the rest of the panel as well.
I would definitely think, when I think of keeping kids out of the system, the first thing that comes to mind is school as an opportunity to change behavior as opposed to an entry point into the justice system. And that happens when school systems, it happens sometimes just individual classrooms or from individual teachers who happen to be really knowledgeable and skilled. But when whole school systems are implementing PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, when whole school systems are implementing restorative justice principles, so that when kids act out, as they inevitably will, that teachers and parents and other children themselves have interventions and ways to deal with those things that don't involve getting a resource officer involved. By the way, we could remove more resource officers and put in more counselors and things of that nature to help kids. But I would also say I don't want to get the conversation confused, because I think some people might dismiss some of what we're talking about as touchy-feely, and what about victims of crime, and the administration of justice is important. But I think, and I think Krista's example of how Germany approaches young people who commit crimes or delinquent offenses is important, in that when that happens, we have programs in place that can deal effectively and help effectively that young person and their family. And so we want to keep children out of the system, but in terms of the administration of justice, when things do happen, there are things that we can do that don't involve incarceration.
And I just want to add very quickly, yes. And we need a two-generational model, that we need to involve the families in everything that everyone said, and understand that some of this, actually a lot of it, is intergenerational anyway. But in terms of prevention and intervention, it should be very much tied to not just the schools, but I agree with the schools, but the neighborhoods, but particularly the family and family engagement and family resources.
I would just add to that we have to make sure that the one time we're usually pretty good at listening to families is when they say, I can't handle him anymore, please lock him up. We listen very closely when parents say that. We don't listen at the other times that I think you're talking about.
Yes.
And I think that we could stop doing. And I think more globally, as I said a second ago, I think what we need to make sure that we're doing with children we're trying to build is treat them as children.
Fantastic. So thank you all, and I'm going to open it up to our next set of people from the audience that are asking questions, but I also want to acknowledge on the phone that if you have a question, #macro social work, those can come in as well for those of you that are online, and we'll share those questions even if we run out of time. So #macro social work, and please.
Hi, Christopher Glenn. I'm Just Leadership, USA, Glenn Martin. I'm sure y'all New Yorkers know about it. I want to say a two-part question, but I'm going to start with the first because I don't see too many gray hairs in here. As I was growing up as a juvenile, my mom stayed home, and she was the everything. Paid the bills and everything. Dad worked, and she was the disciplinarian too, right? And I can see the faces in here that your mom and dad really didn't raise you if moms had to work. Am I correct? Right? You get the nannies, the babysitters, and the child daycare centers, or after work or whatever they got now. So who's raising your child? The second part of it is the discipline end of it. There's laws that we can no longer discipline our children. I'm a granddad now. I got a 12-year-old granddaughter teach me how to dance. But she hasn't done anything wrong for her mother to be disciplined her, or maybe a timeout. But if she decides, or one day decides, I'm going to run away because I can't get my way, so you have a problem. Or I'm going to run away if you threaten to discipline me. Parents have been taken out of the system as far as our children are concerned, because the children know that I can lock my moms up, and that's who's home most of the time. Because as a black man, most of the dads are incarcerated and whipped along with the poverty. So answer me on that. Can we diminish the discipline of it, because we do have judges and things of that nature, of how severe are you punishing your child? Thank you.
Can I really, really want to answer that. So, because, and hopefully my mother will never see this because she'll be a little embarrassed, but, I did mention I grew up in the rural South in the 70s. And it was it was when you went to get your own switch and you needed to bring back the right size. And if you didn't, your mother would go out and get a much worse switch, if not the whole tree. So I understand where you're coming from. And it was something that I saw a lot. And I saw my peers in encounters with their parents, which was not always positive. But I don't know, from my experience, if those kids stayed out of the justice system because of that. Most of the black kids I grew up with were later incarcerated or they died. Sometimes it depends. And what I know about the data is that what studies are showing is that children are often traumatized by physical discipline, and it can stay with them. And of course, the severe discipline is generally what a lot of the data looks at. but not all of it.
Act out when you have a one-parent system. Kids need both, mother and father.
Well, yeah, we could talk all day about that because that actually is my dissertation topic. And, so, and I'm just going to say that the negative outcomes for children who grow up in a single-parent household, and we're usually talking about single moms, does not always play out the same way for single dads or for middle-class mothers who have chosen, who are often white and often upper middle class, who have made the choice to be a single mom. So the outcomes for those two sets of kids are different. So that's another panel.
But,
Thank you, though.
Thank you so much for that very provocative question and also your passion. I want to hear all of what Robert and others would have to say. But I want to just take a break because we have Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who actually represents us in New York, here to say a few words of welcome. And so I want to invite you to say a few words, and thank you so much for coming, and then we'll get to additional questions.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here with you today, and thank you for coming here and for devoting your afternoon to this critical issue of the link between the juvenile justice system, poverty, and race. This discussion is extremely important, and I'm glad that Congress is turning its attention to these issues, and I would say that President Obama has made this a focus and part of his legacy. This year, as a ranking member on the Joint Economic Committee, we have zeroed in on some of these issues. If you look at the markets, at housing prices, at the national unemployment rate, we see some good news. The economy is slowly but surely climbing back from the depths of the recession. You got to remember when President Obama took office, we were shedding 800,000 jobs a month, but we've now had 68 straight months of job growth. Yet for too many across the country, and particularly for too many African Americans, the recession is still an everyday reality. Current unemployment for Black Americans is more than double the rate for white Americans. In fact, at 9.2%, it's the same as the highest rate the white population experienced at the worst of the recession. What's more, African Americans are much more likely to be in the ranks of the long-term unemployed, searching for work for 6 months or more. For youth, this crisis is particularly stark. For Black Americans, 20, 24-year-olds, unemployment rate is over 17%, well above the overall rate of 10%. For teens, it's nearly 30%. The McSilver Institute's recent report on the trauma of racism provides us an opportunity lens to understand these realities and create innovative policy solutions. The inequities identified stem from nearly every facet of American life, from our justice system to education to housing to health care. And there's no panacea to erase years and years of discriminatory policies and broken promises. But that is no excuse for inaction, and I'm proud that leaders like you are here to highlight the challenges too many communities face, as well as the real prospects for change and reform. I am delighted to be here. I'd be delighted to answer any questions if you have any questions. If not, I'll go back to work. Okay, thank you so much. All right, thank you.
Mine's for the general panel, but please feel free to hop in, Congresswoman. My name is Erin, and I'm currently working as a fellow in Congresswoman Jackson Lee's office. I am a social work student, so this panel is like a big reason why I came up to DC to learn about issues like this. We're in my classes and in society a lot, you hear about the word stigma, and what is being done, and what can we like help add to in my office or in general to end the stigma between minority communities and police, but also the stigma police have about minority communities. I think that's a big issue. It definitely goes both ways. So that's my question.
Well, I'll just say that I feel that every member of Congress is a glorified social worker. So you're really in the right place, and we look at people's problems both from an individual point of view and from a universal point of view. In terms of stigma, I think one of the very important activities that the president's involved now is this whole prison reform sentencing reform. You look at the numbers, the numbers of black unemployment is staggering. But then when you look at assets, whites have something like 12 times more the assets than African Americans. But if you look at the prison justice system, Africans are far more likely to be in prison for small offenses, of being caught in some small way. And he's really looking at sentencing reform and, very importantly, not having that stigma with you for the rest of your life, where you can't get a job, you can't vote, you can't do this, you can't do that. I think it's critically important. We have more people in jail than all the rest of the world combined, practically. I mean, and if we could help rehabilitate these people, we don't even do enough to help them, educate them, and give them a way of life that they can stay out of prison. And some of the programs that they've instituted that are model programs has stopped the recidivism of going back into jail. They usually just put them in jail and then they throw them out with $2 and they have no way to go, no place to live, nothing to do, and they end up back in jail. So I think this initiative that he's working on is critically important, and one that I totally support. I think we're working in New York, that I'm privileged to represent, with a lot of reforms in our stop and frisk program and changing it and being more sensitive. And although it still exists, they've cut down dramatically in the number of stop and frisks. And Loretta Lynch, who also comes from New York, who's the new AG, she is coming out with a whole report on just the point that you're talking about. So I think that that's something we're going to all be waiting for and waiting to see. I mean, she has a lot of experience, and she has been reviewing the violence cases that we've had in New York and across the country. So anyway, you're in the right place if you want to study social work, I'll tell you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Erin Burns-Main. I'm from the Corporation for Supportive Housing, also based in New York. Thank you so much, panelists, for being here and for your statements. And I'm glad that Congresswoman brought up housing, because it's something we didn't hear about during the panel. One thing we did hear from Dr. Hawkins was about the barriers that become created to these critical resources that folks need. And to me, housing is a big one of those. I think housing sometimes can be the reason for entry into these systems, and also can be a reason why someone can't get back on their feet afterwards due to some of the barriers that have been created. So my question to the panel is, what role does stable housing play in disrupting the pipeline? And what role could it play? And how can we remove the barriers for the young adults we're talking about today?
I think I'm going to start unless, okay, great. So I'm so glad that you asked that question. As I mentioned, we've been looking at underserved populations, and homeless youth are definitely one of those populations. So I promise I don't know you. I didn't plant that question, but I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about this. So a few things about sort of the intersection between housing and juvenile justice specifically. One of the big barriers that many people know and many people don't is that once you have a criminal record or even a juvenile record, that can keep you from being able to live in publicly assisted housing. And so the problem is, not only does that make the young people homeless when they're exiting, but it also contributes to the breakup of families, because now a family, a mom or a dad, has to decide, do I give up my housing that I'm using for myself and my other children to have this young person back in my life? And so it's just honestly tragic. So I think that's a definite reform that's needed. I think that we also see, and I'll say right now, I don't know that there's data on this, this is just something that anecdotally a lot of people in the juvenile justice system just kind of know happens. What we see is that kids who otherwise would be able to leave a juvenile detention facility, because there's nowhere to send them. Now, sometimes that's because they were in a foster care placement and that placement is now gone. Sometimes it's because a parent doesn't want them back. Sometimes it's because they were homeless to begin with. For whatever reason, we do hear, from people on the ground that kids will end up staying weeks longer in a juvenile detention facility because there's nowhere to send them. There's not a stable home. And we just didn't have enough time to get into it, but being in a juvenile detention center is it's traumatizing. It exposes you to peers who also are dealing with their own trauma and who in many cases have maybe committed worse offenses and so on. And so every day that you're staying in that kind of environment it is just very harmful, and it contributes to all of the worst outcomes. So I think that's another way that lack of stable housing plays into it. I hope that's enough answers. Did anyone else?
Well, and just real quick, there's an important piece of legislation that was just dropped by Senator Kane yesterday on a bipartisan basis that deals specifically with the family unification and stabilization process. And in the bill, it talks about the child welfare context, keeping families together and stable in the context of child welfare. But like I said earlier, if up to 2/3 of the young people who touch the juvenile justice system have also touched the child welfare system, we're talking about the same kids and the same families, and there's a lot of overlap that is important. And just real quick, jumping back to the stigma and the police interaction issue, Title V of the JJDPA specifically is to promote local delinquency prevention grants and target and engage law enforcement in working with communities to build those youth law enforcement relationships. Funding for that has been cut by 80% between fiscal year 2002 and 2015. And so when we're advocating, those are things to think about exactly when we know that improving community police relations will help, especially with those points of discretion when kids first contact the system. We need, money, no mission, right? We need funds to be able to help support those kinds of community building interactions.
So I just want to thank you for those answers. You can see that we could talk about this issue and field these questions all afternoon. The trouble is the people in the live stream, you're going to be cut off in just a minute. So I want to first of all have us once again thank our panelists and thank you for participating at home and here.